Hi, I'm Takoa De Silva, and I'm sitting down here today with Mr. Rick Rule, Chairman of Sprott US Holdings. Rick, as always, good to see you.
My pleasure, Takoa. Thanks for setting us up.
Yeah, a subject I'd like to speak with you about today is one that I hope will be timely, and that is the subject of Africa as a destination for capital, for resource investment. And I'd like to ask, how do you view the content from a resource and from an investment standpoint?
Well, I have a long experience investing in Africa, most good but some bad. And so there's lots of things to say about it. In terms of prospectivity, that is, as a place to make world-class deposits, I would suggest to you that Africa and Central Asia are the last great frontiers in natural resource exploration, partly because political and social challenges have kept them from being as thoroughly explored as Western nations. But I also think that the sociology of Africa is improving fairly rapidly. The young generation of Africans wants to live the way that you and I live. And while there are still some challenges in the way, they're demanding improvements in governance. And it has been governance that has really held back Africa as an investment destination for the last 50 years. So my outlook for Africa is very bright. That isn't to suggest that there aren't great challenges in front of us. The recent kidnapping in Burkina Faso would be one example of the challenges that are facing us. But I think the opportunities are larger than the risks, if you are willing to take those risks.
You mentioned an interesting item there, governance, and I've seen some material that has suggested historical real challenges with governance, regulatory structure, ability to participate as a local. What do you see that there that's encouraging?
An increasing demand by Africans for internal reform in Africa. Too often, I think, traditional communities in Africa have relied on the big man syndrome. In other words, the boss will protect us. And what happened was that the bosses protected them from being wealthy, from in certain circumstances even being able to feed their families. And the younger generation in Africa, which I'm increasingly in touch with through organizations like Students for Liberty, are demanding real reforms. And while there's a lot to be done with regards to this, the change I've seen in the attitudes, this is anecdotal, of course, I'm not an African expert, I'm a speculator, but the changes that I've seen in the attitudes of Africans that I've corresponded with and done business with in the last 5 years are very dramatic and very encouraging.
Rick, from an investment standpoint, in the natural resource business, who do you see in Africa and who don't you see?
Well, there are Western institutions, institutional investors, primarily generalists, people not from an extractive industry background, that have painted Africa as a do-not-go place. There are certainly governance challenges. Well, I'm not suggesting that Western democracies aren't corrupt too. The corruption that you see in Africa is overt. And many of the ways that extractive industries have had to do business traditionally in Africa, bribery, are proscribed, that is, illegal to Western companies. So businesses have had to change. Certainly, the decreasing prominence of Western investment in Africa has been met by an increasing prominence of investors from the GCC nations, from Turkey, and particularly from China. But I think the important thing to note, Takoa, Africa is all aflutter right now about the Chinese promise to invest $60 billion in Africa over the next few years as part of the extension of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's estimated by fairly authoritative sources that $50 billion a year in African capital flows out of the continent to other places. In other words, in 1 year, $50 billion goes out of Africa to be replaced by $60 billion over some period of time. The most important transformation that needs to happen in Africa is African investment in Africa. I, as an outsider, am much less interested in investing in an African project if I don't have African partners. Africa has the human skills. As an example, if you were to look through the ranks of the major multinational oil and gas or mining companies, you would see many indigenous African nationals in those companies working worldwide. The idea that Africa requires a technology transfer from the West is silly. The African professional class is already large and talented. What needs to change in Africa for widespread investment is that the political and social climate in Africa needs to change to the point where African capital can be attracted to Africa, not just ours.
So Rick, let's say I'm a beginning natural resource investor and I'm listening to this interview and I say, okay, great, I like what I hear. Sit down and talk to me. How do you look at the continent and in terms of regionally, opportunities, types of companies that you might consider, and how to deploy capital in such a way as hopefully not to lose it?
To begin with, that question revolves around the investor, how speculative they are, what their time horizons are, what their perceptions are. The biggest investment risks that we face aren't things like Africa or government. I've said for many years that the biggest investment risk that I face is conveniently located to the right of my left ear and to the right of my to the right of my left ear and to the left of my right ear. So it begins with you. But assuming that an investor comes to know himself or herself, I think that you've asked a very broad question. I am willing to take a lot of technical risk. So what appeals to me are the exploration companies. What appeals to me are the companies that can take exploration concepts, take some social risk, and discover very, very, very large deposits. I've been fortunate in my life to have participated in a few of those. The Africa oil discovery of 1 billion barrels of oil in northern Kenya, a previously undrilled place. Paladin's uranium discoveries in Namibia and Malawi, which ran the stock from 10 cents to $10, a very fond memory, as you might imagine. Tenke Mining's tremendous success in the Congo, Moto Gold's 10 million ounce success at Kibale. The thing that appeals to me is exploration. But certainly we've seen that more mature companies attract attention today, as well. Witness today's announcement by Barrick that they were buying the preeminent African gold developer Randgold, despite having a year ago said that they were going to forswear risky destinations on a global basis. I guess Barrick has had cause to rethink what constitutes risk. The ability to operate in a jurisdiction that you understand that's perceived as others by risky, while delivering best-in-class returns on capital employed, which Randgold has done for 20 years, gives rise to a rethinking of the definition of risk. And I think if you redefine risk to include the risk of technical failure, because the probabilities of technical success are higher in frontier areas, then Africa returns to focus.
So the teams that you're corresponding with, that you have an interest in financing, whether it's exploration or a development stage, what are they looking at? What are they doing? What excites them most here right now?
Well, it's a wide open place. The geological terrains are relative to North American and Australian terrains completely unexplored. The terrains that get the most attention from North Americans are probably the Archean and Proterozoic terrains of West Africa. The gold belts that bear geological similarities to the great gold belts in Western Australia and Eastern Canada. And while the industry has made 10 or 15 large discoveries there, West Africa, at least in terms of the Archean, Birimian greenstone belts, are really literally unexplored compared to similar terrain in Australia and Canada. Similarly, if you care about the copper business, other than Chile, there's only one real copper field in the world, and that is the Zambian copper belt, which takes in the southern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Katanga, and Zambia. Tremendous discoveries being made there. I would suggest to you that when the history books are written, that the Ivanhoe Kamoa-Kakula discovery will be the most important copper discovery on a global basis in the last 100 years. Truly spectacular. A virgin belt, not quite virgin, but a nearly virgin belt in northeastern Africa, in the Horn of Africa, is the Nubian gold belt. One great deposit there, the Centamin deposit, a 10 million ounce plus deposit. But I think as you look around the continent, there are all sorts of opportunities. Another couple that come to mind are the Lake Victoria Gold Belt, which extends from Democratic Republic of Congo down through Kenya and Tanzania. And certainly, should South Africa ever get around to really reforming its mining charter in a way that became investor-friendly, the most probably understood terrain that still has a lot of exploration success to yield would be South Africa itself.
Rick, what experience do you have financing resource companies that may be operating in conflict jurisdictions?
It's a challenge. I mean, certainly the experience that Global Resource Investments, the predecessor to Sprott Global, had in Congo in the mid-90s is illustrative. We were active in exploration in Congo during a period of time when there was an active civil war. A civil war that's estimated to have killed 2 million people directly and indirectly. And it was certainly a challenge. The prospectivity was such that if you were an exploration speculator, you almost had to be there. This is going to sound very heartless to COA, but a copper deposit that was put in place 45 million years ago doesn't care too much about the stupidity of the people killing each other on top of it. And the copper will last longer than the conflict will. That doesn't mean that a speculator will have either the patience or the confidence to weather the storm. And it is a strategy that is only suited to people who can afford a risk of 100% of the capital that they employ in hopes of extraordinary gains. But it is also a circumstance that any speculator in natural resources has to consider.
How do you define political risk?
The risk that actions taken by government will deprive me of legitimately generated wealth. By that standard, of course, the jurisdiction that I live in, California, is probably one of the riskiest jurisdictions in the world. It's just that we look at risk differently to COA. Risks that look like us, risks that we understand, the risks that in fact we participate in creating are regarded as somehow less venal. People will hate to hear this, but I love to say it. Money stolen by white people in English, according to the rule of law, is just as gone as money that's stolen more efficiently by traditional methods.
What would you like to do over the next year in the areas of Africa that you're most interested in now?
Well, the part of resource speculation that interests me is exploration. And the subset of explorers that interest me the most are the prospect generators, the people who use their investment acumen and their commercial acumen, and frankly their courage, to explore virgin or semi-virgin terrain and then bring in joint venture partners to drill. Unfortunately, there aren't very many prospect generators in Africa. So the universe that I have to explore is fairly small. The other thing that I like to do is find deposits that are becoming well understood and easy to value, that have been greatly depressed in price because of perceived or real political risk. My suspicion is now that the recent political unrest, as an example in Burkina Faso, will cause gold investors to desert Burkina Faso for areas that have political stability but probably less gold. And one consequence of that is if there was a deposit in Burkina Faso that we thought objectively was worth 300 or 400 million dollars in its current stage of development, and the market capitalization was 60 or 70 million dollars, with some exploration upside. The idea that I could take the near-term political risk, knowing that the gold was already in place, in other words, that the big question was already answered, and take a risk on the social and political developments in Burkina Faso, that's something that I would certainly be tempted to do. I would be tempted to do.
Rick, what's the best way for the person watching, if they'd like to learn more and participate somehow with these ideas? What can they do?
I think they should contact us, contact@sprottglobal.com. The more we know about an investor's appetite for risk, appetite for reward, time frame, the more that we can talk about a topic as broad as Africa in the context of one's own portfolio. The broad topic of Africa probably isn't of much interest to investors and shouldn't be. The topic of what Africa can do for them is paramount. And in that context, we would need to have an African discussion around an individual's aspirations.
Rick Rule, Chairman of Sprott US Holdings, thanks for sharing your comments with us.
Pleasure. Thank you.